Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, for those who are just tuning in, welcome to the Summit APAC 2021. Before we get to the core of the summit, Stephen and I thought that it would be a good idea to establish a baseline for the most important fleet countries in Asia-Pac. As you will probably know, it's hard to capture APAC fleet landscape in a few words. So what I will do for the next 20 minutes or so is share with you in 4 bullet points per country, the things that you need to know before you start any project in these countries. So these 4 bullet points are: what is the typical solution for employee transportation? Is it operational lease or finance lease or perhaps something else? Number 2, how does a country compare to a Western model? Do you have good lease providers, for example? Number 3, would I recommend you to do a lease tender? And number 4, would I recommend you to do an OEM tender? But before we go into the countries, we'll be talking briefly about the main leasing vendors and the main OEMs. Now, a bit of a disclaimer first. The objective of this presentation is to give you a generic idea of each country, and that also means that there are many exceptions and many specifications that we will not capture. But I hope this will already set the stage for the presentations that will come today and tomorrow. So let's start with OEM and leasing companies. What you need to remember now is that the Asian fleet ecosystem has not yet gone through the massive consolidation phase that we have known in Europe and the US. This means that we still have many local players, and that even the international players are often organized locally rather than regionally. Looking at the OEMs, I'd like to mention the 3 biggest regional players who are also very active on the global scene. There's obviously Toyota, massive Japanese OEM that manufactures cars in many Asian countries. This means that not all Toyotas are imported from Japan. A good example is the Toyota Hilux, which is produced in Thailand, or the Toyota Innova produced in Indonesia. The production side has always been extremely important in APAC simply because of the high import taxation. For instance, in Vietnam, you'll have to pay up to 70% of import tax or special sales tax on imported vehicles. This is changing for the better. The Southeast Asian countries now have their own free trade agreement, which will bring taxation down between these countries. Nonetheless, when you select vehicles for your employees, please bear in mind that there is a tax component that will potentially impact your TCO dramatically. Nissan is another Japanese OEM with very good coverage across the APAC region. The brand has very good reputation, and they're also the only Asian brand that has a true global corporate fleet sales department. So this makes your life a bit easier. Finally, Kia and Hyundai, and let's get this out of the way. If you need cars in South Korea, you will need to select Kia and Hyundai. The Koreans are very proud of their home brands, and rightly so. However, if you're looking into selecting Kia or Hyundai for your fleets across APAC, you might be in for a challenge. In most countries, you will have to negotiate locally, so be prepared for this. If you want to select European brands, your budgets will need to follow. It's going to be expensive, and parts will not always be available immediately. Now, let's have a look at the leasing companies. So the 2 biggest local providers or regional providers are Sumitomo and Oryx, both Japanese companies. They both have pretty good coverage across the region. Oryx perhaps a little bit better than Sumitomo. What you need to know about them, especially comparing with European lease providers, is that they will not have the same type of leasing products as the ones we know in Europe. You will find very often in many countries contracts on duration only, so no mileage. This also means that there's no possibility to recalculate contracts or have mileage credits at the end of the contract. On top of that, it's a bit more difficult to have a regional agreement, although especially Oryx is working on a more regional offering. Finally, quick shout out to ALD, who has just started in Malaysia with a European product, and who is planning to expand into Southeast Asia. Now it's time to go into the different countries. For the purpose of this presentation, I have created country groups based on a number of criteria. One is geography. The second one is cultural similarities, and I'm explicitly using the word similar and not identical. And number 3, services and service levels. You might also consider these country groups for your own fleet organization. I do know that from a business organization perspective, your company might apply different grouping, but the country groups that I'm using might make more sense from an operational point of view. So let's kick off with North Asia, and more specifically with the biggest country in the region, China. Operational leasing is very small in China, and other acquisition methods are much more popular. Most companies and many consumers will purchase cars or take a lease loan, which is a bit of a confusing name because it's closer to a balloon finance than a real lease. Now, even if lease is available in China, most of the employees will simply expense their costs to the company or receive a mileage expense. If you want to give cars to your employees, now that's going to be expensive. And also know that in tier 1 cities, such as Beijing and Shanghai, license plates are not easily available. So even if you want to give cars and you're willing to pay, you might not be able to get a plate. Now, South Korea is next. This is a mature country from a fleet perspective. There are some really good leasing providers, such as Hyundai Capital, Lotte, and SK. They offer a comprehensive contract, often on 74 months because of tax recovery reasons. It's not common to do an OEM tender in Korea because the leasing companies will include volume discounts into their pricing automatically. Leasing tenders are, however, possible, but you'll need a Korean speaker and you'll need patience because the communication between a leasing company and a client during a tender will be quite intense. The biggest fleet country in Asia-Pac is Japan. Leasing is extremely common, almost always on 36-month contracts because of the mandatory technical inspection that's called shaken, which is pretty expensive and mandatory for cars that are 3 years old. I would not recommend to do an OEM tender unless your volumes are very high. Now, the biggest obstacle in Japan is not the maturity of the market, but rather the process of making change to your supply chain. In Europe, we do a tender and we select our vendors. In Japan, however, it's not possible to change and implement a new vendor without going through a long process of building trust and relationship. This might not come across as an obstacle, but you need to realize that this will slow you down for roughly a year. And to be honest, the Japanese way of selecting a vendor is not entirely wrong. The process is meant to establish a relationship, of course, but also to remove each and every risk from that relationship. You need to know that the Japanese don't accept any error margin. In other words, the service needs to be 100% perfect, and that takes time to establish. It also means that your local stakeholders are most probably not eager to go through a tender process, and they will prefer to leave things as they are. So you'll need to come up with some pretty good arguments on why to go ahead with a leasing tender. Next country on the list, Hong Kong, very small fleet country and not a cheap one either. Hong Kong people usually don't have parking space for a company car, and public transport is very good and it's affordable. So best is to avoid company cars and give budget for taxi, for Uber or public transport. Taiwan is a modern, well-functioning country with very professional people. This also reflects in the corporate car ecosystem. There's a few good leasing companies. OEMs are professional, and it's not uncommon for international companies to provide a company car. Your costs in Taiwan will be a bit higher than in Japan and Korea, but still not excessive. Overall, a very pleasant country to work with. Let's move to South Asia. India is obviously the biggest country in the region, and the good news is that there is, amongst other, Oryx, ALD, Arval, and LeasePlan to work with, and they're pretty good at what they do. However, operational leasing is not popular, and my educated guess is that there is less than 20,000 operational lease contracts in the entire country. The reason for this is that operational leasing is considered to be some sort of a luxury product for international companies. Many local companies will offer an allowance or a salary sacrifice system to their employees, which is a completely different product. You do have an abundance of choice when it comes to vehicles. Many OEMs have developed products specifically for India and actually assemble or produce these vehicles in India, which is good because you avoid the import taxes. The Indians are very creative when it comes to form factor. You'll find in India a lot of small vehicles and people tend to like them. Also, the Indian OEMs produce very good vehicles in all form factors, from small hatchback to large SUVs. And I would definitely recommend to have a closer look at brands like Maruti Suzuki, Tata, or Mahindra. Now, the latest trend in India is electrification. The Indian government has launched some incentives that might be worth considering, but be aware that charging infrastructure is limited, even in the metros, but this will gradually improve. Very briefly on the smaller countries in South Asia. Bangladesh people are a pleasure to work with. They're very professional and they do a good job. The one thing missing in Bangladesh is the supply chain. You will have to pay for your cars in cash or go to a bank for a finance agreement, but there is almost no leasing provider. I would also recommend to build a good working relationship with some dealers in the biggest cities. Pakistan is a very interesting country. My feeling is that we underestimate the number of company cars in Pakistan. It is, however, quite a challenge to provide cars. There's some local production, and the Honda Civic is an example of a locally produced car, but many cars need to be imported from other countries, especially from Japan. These are vehicles that have been registered in Japan and sold as second-hand cars in Pakistan. The trouble here is that it's a non-official site import where you'll need to trust the trader that you work with. Also, interacting with Pakistan is difficult because internet connections are not the best and travel is very difficult for Pakistani. So if you want to meet face-to-face with your local stakeholders, it's much easier to organize a meeting in Dubai because they're allowed to travel there without much admin. Sri Lanka, you'll need to talk to rental providers or find an agreement with a dealer. It's a small island and you will most probably don't have many cars over there, but please know that if you give cars, they won't be very cheap. So let's have a look at Southeast Asia and start with Singapore. It's very simple. You will most probably not give company cars in Singapore, except to your CEO. Cars are crazy expensive, but public transport is amazing and mobility solutions are available. Now, Thailand is becoming a big leasing country. Vendors are pretty good, although not on the Western level. And it's absolutely possible to find reasonably priced cars, most often Toyota Vios, Hilux, or Honda Civic, Honda City. Some lease vendors will propose products with mileage, but don't expect it from all of them. Generally, you will have few issues in Thailand. You do need to know that it's not unusual for your Thai employees to work in Bangkok, but live pretty far outside of the city, or to be based in Bangkok, but work hundreds of kilometers down the country. This means that it's possible that your employees will be doing in excess of 60,000 kilometers per year. Indonesia, it's a beautiful country, but it's also a huge country. Your fleet will most probably be spread over a few of Indonesia's many islands. So there's a few things that you need to bear in mind. First, traffic in the capital region of Jakarta is horrible, and it actually doesn't make any sense to add more vehicles. So why not look at alternatives? Second, you need to know exactly where your fleet will be driving, because not all vendors are present in all of the islands, so this will be your main selection criteria. Third thing to remember, most of the leasing vendors in Indonesia are doing leasing as a side job. They are car manufacturers or they are dealer groups, but they are most often not professional leasing companies. So getting SLAs and KPIs in place can be a bit of a challenge. As for Malaysia, I'm not going to say too much as we have a dedicated session from ALD, but remember that outright purchase is very popular in Malaysia, and especially the level of admin in Malaysia is pretty high. Philippines, again, a big country with lots of islands. Leasing is pretty well established, although most companies in Philippines prefer to buy cars. Leasing contracts are typically in two parts, a first contract of 36 months and a second contract extension of 24 months. The fleet management product is also very popular in the Philippines for companies that have decided to buy their cars rather than lease them. Finally, Vietnam and Cambodia. These countries are not very mature from a leasing perspective. Cars are expensive because of import taxation, and you will need to work with local vendors. We do expect some change in Vietnam, which is one of the most successful economies in APAC, at least in terms of GDP growth. Australia and New Zealand. Let me be very short on these two countries. They are very mature markets, and you can basically expect a similar type of service that you would expect from a European provider. Just remember that Australia has an interesting product that is called novated lease. It's a sort of salary sacrifice whereby the employer deducts all or part of the lease rate from the employee's gross salary. It comes with a fair bit of administration, and leasing companies, or FMOs as they're called in Australia and New Zealand, can help you with that. So that's it from a country overview perspective. So what should you remember about Asia-Pac? First, it is solution diverse, it is supplier diverse, and it is very local. But this also means that there's a lot of potential for the fleet manager in APAC. And this potential is exactly what we will be discussing today and tomorrow during the Summit APAC. So Stephen, that's it from my side. I hope you found it interesting.